Hello, and welcome to Law and Order Statistical Victims Unit, Episode 1, An Introduction to Null Hypotheses. In the original research system, statistically based investigations are considered especially heinous. In Houston, Texas, the dedicated scholars who investigate these vicious problems are members of an elite squad known as the Statistical Victims Unit, aka DSP. These are their stories. All right. So actual law and order. The police explore the crime scene and follow leads until they have enough evidence to support the hypothesis that a particular person is the perpetrator of the particular crime. The DA then presents the evidence to support the hypothesis in a court of law, operating under the assumption that the alleged perpetrator is innocent. The DA must present evidence that convinces the jury beyond reasonable doubt that the perpetrator is guilty. There's two possible outcomes. One, the jury decides the evidence does not demonstrate guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and declares the alleged criminal to be not guilty. Notice that they don't say that they're innocent. They just say, okay, the data are consistent, the evidence is consistent with the alleged criminal, the defendant, being not guilty. There's another possible outcome, and that is the jury decides the evidence demonstrates beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. Now keep in mind, all along, that is what the prosecutor is hoping for. So, what does this have to do with research and hypotheses? I'm glad you asked. Researchers often play both roles, investigator and prosecutor. They gather evidence, the data, then see if the data provides sufficient evidence for the hypothesis they believe is true. Does it provide what would be analogous to evidence beyond a reasonable doubt? Just like the DA hypothesizes that a particular person committed a crime, a researcher hypothesizes that a certain condition or effect exists. Just like the DA gathers evidence to support the claim that the defendant committed the crime, the researcher gathers evidence that will, hopefully, support the research hypothesis. The research hypothesis, the one that the researcher believes to be true, is actually referred to as the alternative hypothesis. Much like in the legal system, the prosecutor's hypothesis is an alternative to the operational assumption that the defendant is innocent. Okay, or not guilty. That is what the whole court system operates under, that assumption, and what the prosecutor has to do is provide enough evidence to be beyond a reasonable doubt that the operational assumptions should not be made. So what is analogous to the assumption of innocence? Okay, if that's the operational assumption for a court case and we're making this analogy, what is the operational assumption for a statistical test? In research, this is called the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is a statement of what the researcher does not expect to happen. Okay, so even though, as you've noticed in the past, when people talk about their research, the emphasis is placed on the null hypothesis, and that's what's reported, the researcher actually believes the opposite of it is true, the alternative hypothesis. For example, a researcher believes that students will score better on the SAT on average if they eat breakfast than if they do not eat breakfast. So the alternative research hypothesis is the average SAT score of students who eat breakfast will be higher than the average SAT scores of students who do not eat breakfast. The null hypothesis would then be the negation of the alternative. The average SAT score of students who eat breakfast will not be higher than the average SAT score of students who do not eat breakfast. So what happens is the null is then the operational assumption. Data is gathered, and the researcher hopes that the data are surprising underneath the null hypothesis, so surprising that they actually form evidence for the alternative. Okay, just like in a court case, that's what the prosecutor does. Okay, so we think this person's innocent. Well, you know, they were at the crime scene with the weapon and their DNA is all over the place, and we have 5 eyewitnesses. That would be enough evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, one would hope, that that person is actually guilty. It's too surprising that a person would have all that evidence against them if they really were innocent. So what you're hoping is that under the null hypothesis, the data that you collect through your survey or experiment or whatever we're going to use, you're hoping that that is going to be surprising enough that, in legal terms, beyond a reasonable doubt, it demonstrates support for your alternative. Now, even though the thought process is that you establish the alternative first and then go to the null, we actually write the null first because that's the operational assumption, and then the alternative, the research hypothesis. So how do I do this? That may be your next question. First, write what you think you will find. This is your alternative hypothesis. If you even have trouble getting to that point, think about what questions still remain and what you would like to study further. And then think about, based on your research, what you think you will find. And that's your alternative. Second, negate your alternative hypothesis. This is your null hypothesis. It is what will be assumed, I've got a little typo, to be true when you conduct your hypothesis test. And there's going to be more on that later. Okay, so that should be enough to help you get started on writing your null hypotheses. Please feel free to email me or come see me and ask me any questions that you have. Thank you for your attention. Have a good day.